Hello and welcome back. This is the week 2 lecture. So let's cover the second half of the narrative, everything from where we left off back in week 1 up to the end. So if you haven't finished the book yet, you might want to hold off on watching this lecture. At the very least, you can stop near the end of the lecture when I sort of reveal the very end of the book and sort of our final impressions of Cabeza de Vaca and this journey that he has gone through. If you don't care about spoilers, just watch on. And of course, if you've already finished the book, now is a great time to watch. So we left off last time on the island of Malhado around page 93. And this is a pivotal moment in the story because this is the first time it appears that Cabeza de Vaca and his fellow survivors from the Narvaez expedition are asked to perform as physicians or healers. This will become very important throughout the second half of the book because ultimately this becomes their job. This becomes their primary occupation later on. Once they leave coastal Texas and fall in with some more friendly native groups, they seem to really start performing almost exclusively as physicians or healers. And eventually they develop a bit of a reputation. They become sort of almost like minor celebrities, and they're able to use that influence, obviously, to their benefit. But I want us to notice how their physician career begins, how their medical careers begin, because they're very skeptical at first. And I want us to notice the reaction they have on page 93 when they are first asked to act as healers. A great example of what we were talking about last week, how Cabeza de Vaca doesn't have a good frame of reference to understand all of the new things that he's encountering in the Americas. He doesn't understand these new cultures. He doesn't understand these practices, these rituals. All he can fall back on are the old things of, Europe and Spain, his religion, the culture and society that he grew up with, his education, and the way things worked back at home. And everything's totally different for him now. So this is a great example. So let's take a look at this passage on the full paragraph on page 93. So they're on Malhado, and the Native Americans ask the survivors to start making themselves useful. So according to Cabeza de Vaca, they tried to make us physicians without examining us or asking for our titles. That part always makes me laugh. They didn't even ask for our titles. Again, he's only thinking about European precedent. He's only thinking about how the medical practice works back in Spain. He's thinking about the kinds of requirements, the kinds of training that a physician would have been expected to have back in his society. So he doesn't understand this new way of doing things. So they asked us without even examining us or asking for titles, because they cure illnesses by blowing on the sick person. And with that breath of air in their hands, they expel the disease from him. And they demanded that we do the same and make ourselves useful. We laughed about this. Notice the reaction. We laughed about this, saying that it was a mockery and that we did not know how to cure. And because of this, they took away our food until we did as they told us. So a very telling moment here. We see very clearly that the Spaniards are not in charge. They are no longer in control. So remember last week I was talking about the breakdown of the expedition, but it's more than that, right? This disillusionment, this idea of desengaño, this disillusionment that they feel when all of the trappings of European civilization that they thought were so great have proven to kind of fail, and they don't have access to their customs, their ways of doing things. They still remember, but none of that stuff matters anymore, because now they're living with native groups who have their own ways of doing things, their own cosmology, their own spiritual beliefs, their own religions, their own cultural practices, their own medical practices. So it doesn't matter what these men are used to. Now they have to adapt new ways. And they don't really have a choice, right? So their initial reaction to the Native American method of healing, at least the method practiced by a lot of these groups that they encounter on their travels, their initial reaction to it is mockery. They laugh. They make fun of it. It seems absurd to them. We can't heal. We don't know how to do that. We're not qualified to do that. And it seems likely that they don't really believe in the effectiveness of these native methods. They think the way that it was done back in Europe is the right way. And whatever's going on here is weird and they don't think it's right. But they have to drop that attitude. They don't have the luxury of continuing to feel that way. Or maybe they feel that way, but they don't have the luxury to continue to act on those feelings. They have to adapt to their circumstances. So eventually they start healing more and more. If you look at the footnote on page 93, the final footnote, Oviedo in his history says the men did not really consistently begin to cure until much later when they were living with a different group, the Avivares, further down the coastline, and that's really when they start doing it consistently, and that's when they start kind of occupying that social role in a way that really does matter, because it changes their social position, it changes their material conditions, it allows them to be treated much better than they had been back in previously on Mojado and in coastal Texas, and it really changes everything about their relationships with the Native Americans that they encounter. So this is a very big shift, but we're going to notice a big change in the way Cabeza de Vaca thinks about his role as a physician. Initially, he laughs at it, but later on, he points out that the men develop big reputations as successful healers. He seems to take a certain amount of pride in that. And I believe at one point he even claims that he was kind of the best healer, that he was thought of as the best among them. But they develop a bit of a following and they start to make alliances. They start to kind of enter into a trade network that they never fully understand, but they start to use some of these things to their benefit because they do occupy this important social role as healers. But that happens a little bit later. This is the first glimpse of it, but they don't become healers right away, at least not on a really consistent basis. So not long after this scene on 93, Cabeza de Vaca falls ill. And he almost dies. And in the process, he is separated from his fellow survivors. It's estimated that he's probably isolated from them for somewhere around 4 years. He's living completely by himself with Native American groups for somewhere between 4 to 5 years. And it's unlikely that he saw any of his fellow survivors during that time. They weren't that far away from him, geographically speaking. We have to remember that the groups that they're with right now are sort of semi-nomadic. They largely travel according to their food sources. They're following the food. So during some times of the year, they're on Mojado, on that island in Galveston Bay. And then at other times, they're on the Texas mainland, or what we would now think of as the mainland of the state of Texas. So at various points, he's not that far from some of these other guys, but he doesn't see them. He's isolated. He doesn't really know what's going on with them. But later, he is reunited. And this is another one of those moments, I think it's around page 100, his initial reunion with Dorantes and Castillo. In a novel or a movie, this would be a moment of high drama. It would be sort of played up for that effect, but he just kind of briefly summarizes it, moves on rather quickly. But the important thing is, eventually, those three guys, along with Estevancio, the slave from probably North Africa who belonged to, I think, Dorantes, or maybe it was Castillo, the four of them eventually get together on the coast of Texas and decide to flee southward. Because at various times, all four of them had been enslaved by these warlike coastal tribes who were largely hostile to them and usually kept them in kind of a subordinate position, at the very least, if not outright slavery. So they're trying to get away from those groups, and they think if they head further down the coast, they'll find perhaps more friendly faces and they'll be able to survive more easily. So from that point on, this is like the spring of 1533. From that point on, Cabeza de Vaca is with these other guys, right? He, along with Dorantes, Castillo, Estevancio, they travel together for the rest of the narrative. But they travel with a lot of Native American followers and friends and allies as they continue to move south. So as I think I mentioned in week 1, a sort of cruel irony for these guys is that they are actually headed towards Panuco as they keep heading southward down the coast as they eventually approach the Rio Grande and the border of modern-day U.S. and Mexico. If they had kept going in that direction, kind of sticking close to the coastline, moving southward, they would have eventually hit Panuco. It would have taken some time, but they would have eventually gotten there. But they change course. That happens a little bit later in the narrative. They change course. We don't know exactly why, but that might be another example of Cabeza de Vaca sort of covering his own ass, providing some self-justification for what might have been a mistake. But we'll get to that as we move along. But it is important to notice that he starts to pay a lot more attention to the Native Americans in the second half of the narrative. We talked about his observations back on the peninsula of Florida, the modern-day state of Florida, back when the expedition was still kind of a thing and they were still somewhat organized. They were lost, of course. They were on the wrong side of the Gulf of Mexico, but before Narvaez and everybody else sort of broke up, we noticed that Cabeza de Vaca's observations of the natives in Florida are very cursory. They're mostly focused on physical traits, how tall they were, how good they were with a bow and arrow, right? But later on, once he gets into Texas, and then especially later, he starts providing more detailed accounts, a greater degree of specificity. He starts paying more attention. So remember what we mentioned before, he becomes almost maybe like an amateur ethnographer. He starts to really document the different cultures, the different kinds of people that they encounter. And they notice that as they get away from that coastal region around the Galveston Bay, the cultures and the societies that they encounter are a little bit different. They are received better, and then as they eventually move into Mexico, they eventually find more sort of populous areas where people practice agriculture, have permanent dwellings, and are a little bit more sophisticated or advanced. So everything changes for them because the people change, and their social positioning within these new groups very much changes as a result of the healing. So you can notice a lot of the ethnographic details. He begins to give them as early as Mojado, when he mentions things like ritual weeping, and obviously he's documenting the some of the spiritual or medical practices of these different cultures. But he does it more as their travels continue. And he tells us more about familial relations, different alliances, wars, but also what the people wear, what they eat, their hunting techniques, what they drink, what they smoke. He's doing his best to record this information because remember, this is an official account. This is a letter of relation, and the primary function of that genre was to be informative, to give the royal decision makers back in Europe enough information so that they could decide whether or not they wanted to colonize and conquer a new place. So he's trying to do that throughout. And he seems to spend more time documenting and detailing Native Americans as his journey progresses. So we get a lot of good stuff to kind of chew on, think about, and analyze more. He really provides a pretty good catalog of a lot of the different peoples and languages that he encounters as they move south from Mojado and start to approach, like we said, the modern-day U.S.-Mexico border region. And that's when they fall in with the Avavares. So according to Oviedo, that's the group that really gets these guys to start functioning full-time as physicians or healers. And the Avavares are very nice to them. They're in the prickly pear region now, as Cabeza de Vaca describes it, and they're treated quite well. They're given pretty much complete freedom. They seem to kind of get trained in some ways as physicians during this time. They learn more and they start doing it more. And Oviedo, in one of the footnotes, claims that they have a lot of freedom. They're allowed to come and go as they please, but the Avavares aren't very prosperous. They live in kind of a hard scrabble, arid region where there isn't a ton of food and resources. So even though they're very personable, kind people, they don't have a lot of material goods to offer the guys. So they're free now, and they're functioning as healers, but they're often naked, they're often hungry, they're often in a great deal of physical discomfort, but their social position has definitely improved. They're being treated better, and their relations are advancing, right? They're learning more. They're establishing sort of more lasting alliances and relationships, and it's becoming more. Perhaps, now this is debatable, but some people argue that it's becoming more of a cultural exchange now. We might see more examples of real transculturation. Even their healing practices might strike us as an example of transculturation, which, remember, is just a term from anthropology, which basically means the combining or the melding of different cultures. This can come about as a result of conflict or peaceful relations, but when different cultures collide, come together, we might get some kind of a hybrid, some kind of a new synthesis that consists of different elements from the different cultures. So maybe that's what we see with the healing. They're doing the blowing technique that they learned from the Native Americans, but they also start making the sign of the cross, which is a Catholic European thing. So maybe just the act of healing, the way these guys are doing it, is an example of transculturation. Maybe they're living with the natives, sharing different, pieces of knowledge, experience. They're picking up a lot of new things, and maybe they're also sharing parts of their culture with these native groups that they are living with. So certainly things are looking up for these guys, not always in like I said, in terms of like material comfort or like living high on the hog, if you know that term, but they are getting along well, and they find value, they find real significance in the healing practices that they take on. Now, what we don't know for certain, we don't really know the full extent of the religious beliefs, the spiritual practices, or the cosmology of the native groups that they are with. Cabeza de Vaca tries to describe as much as he can, but obviously he doesn't know everything. He doesn't understand a lot of things that he's witnessing or hearing. So we're getting kind of a fragmented, incomplete portrait. But we are pretty sure that at least some of these native groups would have regarded these white bearded Spaniards as probably being possessed of some kind of special ability. Not everybody thought that, but the Avavares in the prickly pear region, they seem to think that. They call the white men the children of the sun. They think they possess, certain spiritual or magical attributes, and that's probably at least part of the reason why they prompt the guys to take on the role of physician. Now, Estevancio might not fit in quite the same way because he's a black man from North Africa, and it does seem like his role was more of interpreter, guide, scout. We learn later that he often goes ahead along with some of their native allies and friends as they're traveling, especially through Mexico later on. He'll go ahead to the next village, Estevancio will, to kind of announce that the healers are on the way. Right? And he's the one who often is best equipped to communicate with other groups because there's lots of different languages. There's lots of different people. So it seems like that's more of Estevancio's role, whereas the three white Spaniards are primarily functioning as the doctors, as the healers. And again, they start to take pride in their reputations. Their reputations grow. People know about them, right? So we learn about this strange system that develops as they travel from village to village in this kind of border region, and then later when they're fully in Mexico. And it's referred to by the editors as ritual pillaging. And it seems like the way it works is the group that they're with, like their current friends and allies who they've picked up along the way, will sort of go ahead with Estevancio and announce the healers are coming to the next village. And in exchange for providing the healing abilities of these guys, the native allies will take the best stuff in the new village. So that's the exchange. If you want the healers to come to your village and work their magic, you're going to have to give the healers' friends a bunch of your best stuff. Just to put it in really crude, simplistic terms. So Cabeza de Vaca observes this, and he doesn't really understand how it works. It strikes him as maybe wrong, as like perhaps exploitative. And again, this takes us back to our uncertainty regarding the spiritual beliefs of these native groups. It seems like some groups truly believed that Cabeza de Vaca and his companions were sort of magical or at least possessed special healing qualities. I'm pretty confident in saying that other groups probably did not believe that. And other groups probably saw it just more as an opportunity to get stuff, to maybe take advantage of these guys' reputations, take advantage of people wanting to heal their sick and their wounded. We don't really know. We don't know how much everybody was buying into the sort of mystical healing powers of these guys. It might have been a more cynical ploy, at least for some, to get stuff. We don't know. Cabeza de Vaca himself seems a little unsure, a little skeptical. He doesn't always seem to trust some of their allies and friends. He thinks that they might be taking advantage, exploiting less fortunate Native Americans, taking their stuff. He doesn't know what to think. And at one point, he even goes to some of his friends and says, hey, don't take these new people's things. Like, I'm not comfortable with you doing that. That doesn't seem right. And they're like, oh, don't worry about it. We're going to take their stuff, but then when we go to the next village, they'll be able to take stuff from the new village. So they'll end up, recouping their losses. It's not a big deal. And he doesn't understand. So again, he sort of rejects it because his cultural knowledge is not quite suited for this particular practice. He's still operating based on, European standards, European precedents. So he kind of feels weird about it. He doesn't quite get it. And he fears that it might be a little bit immoral. But again, he's applying his standards, his values to people that are very different and people that he only sort of partially understands. So that's another interesting part of the narrative to navigate. Like, what do we make of that ritual pillaging? Do we think he's interpreting it correctly? Or do we think the real issue is just he doesn't understand and he's reacting to a lack of knowledge? His ignorance might be the biggest problem there. It depends on how you read it. So they continue to travel. They continue to sort of develop reputations as healers. But one thing I did want to mention, and they point this out in the book, around page 124, I think there's a footnote telling you that from that point on, he ceases to name any of the Native American groups that he encounters. And this is strange because up until then, he was trying to identify different groups by name. Now, we're not always sure of the accuracy of the names. We don't know that he was correctly identifying everybody. And because this was so long ago, historians have struggled to kind of figure out exactly who he's referring to in certain cases. In other cases, like in coastal Texas and, even like Louisiana and parts of northern Mexico, they can sort of speculate or theorize that some of these groups that Cabeza de Vaca met were probably the ancestors of modern day groups that are still in those areas or still native to those areas. But it's kind of hard to know for sure. But he's at least trying to name them until they start moving further southward down the coast and their relations improve. Though we notice that he's providing more ethnographic detail, what he stops providing is names. And we don't really know why. He does refer back to some other groups that he had previously named, but none of the new groups that they encounter after like page 124, 125, 130, none of the new groups that they encounter really get named. And we're not sure why he stops providing names. There's lots of theories. Some people think that maybe it just became more difficult as they entered more densely populated areas in the border region and then later in Mexico. It might have been harder for him to distinguish between different groups. We know that they were encountering different cultures and different languages, but he might not have always understood the different kinship networks, like how these groups might have been related. He might not have always understood alliances. He might have mistaken some people as being the same, when in reality they were two different tribes who just were allied together. It's hard to know. But for whatever reason, he drops the names, but he increases the other kinds of details about customs, religion, other practices, crops that they grew, social organization. He gives a lot more of that, but he does stop giving the names. So yeah, they developed this great reputation. It's a far cry from back in coastal Texas when Cabeza de Vaca was digging up roots naked. They've come a long way. But they make that change of course. I had a page number for that. Where do they do that? Around, I think, 138, they decide to go overland. Instead of continuing to move southward down the coast in the general direction of Panuco, they decide to go west. And like I said before, they eventually cross the entire breadth of Mexico. They end up in northwestern Mexico, near the Pacific. And there's still a debate as to why they did this. Some scholars think that it was just a mistake. They still didn't really understand the geography, didn't really understand where they were. Cabeza de Vaca, though, provides some justification. He claims that they had heard that there were more advanced people further to the west who had settled, villages and practiced agriculture, maybe even metalworking and other things that would have struck the Spanish as very advanced and very, sophisticated. So he claims, hey, we wanted to find those people. We wanted to go further to the west where we could find, bigger population centers, people with more food, people who could help us more, people who would probably be a little bit more friendly and be in a better position to help travelers moving through their land. So that's kind of the reason that he gives. But if you look on page 138, you should see a footnote from the editors where they tell you that Oviedo that doesn't really have that particular scene in his history, which means that the whole explanation of, moving west to find more advanced people, that wasn't in the joint account that Cabeza de Vaca wrote with Castillo and Dorantes. So there is some question as to whether perhaps Cabeza de Vaca invented it and inserted it in his later 1542 narrative that we are reading to absolve himself of any blame. To say, hey, it wasn't a mistake, it was just, we were trying to find people who would be more accommodating. And like we've said before, they did seem to notice that along the coast, a lot of the tribes were more semi-nomadic and warlike. So maybe they wanted to get away from that and find people that would receive them better, much like some of the groups that they were starting to encounter in the Prickly Pear region and around the Rio Grande. We don't know. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they had good reasons for doing it. But by page 150, or 151, it sounds like they're pretty much committed to finding the South Sea, which is what they called the Pacific. The Pacific had been discovered maybe like 2 or 3 decades prior, I think, by Cortez. So they knew where it was in a general sense, but they didn't have a great idea of the extent of it or the exact location. So I think they called the Atlantic the North Sea and the Pacific the South Sea. So they eventually seem to realize that they are no longer going in the way of Panuco, whether that was intended or deliberate initially or not, I don't know, but they seem to sort of get committed to just going the other way and trying to find the South Sea. And as they get closer and closer to the Pacific, they see more and more signs of other Spanish people. Right? They start to get the sense, and they also hear from their native friends that the Spanish have been around there. So they start to think, okay, we're getting closer to what they would have thought of as civilization, Spanish civilization. So they keep going west. That's a pretty big change to their route, and that's why they end up really extending their journey and covering even more ground. So again, maybe that's Cabeza de Vaca trying to cover his own ass and say it wasn't my fault, or maybe he's just accurately documenting what happened. That's up for debate, certainly. So they hear about these people, the people of the cows. Again, this is probably somewhere in the Rio Grande area, either like south central Texas, maybe north central Mexico. But this is really the most advanced group that they've encountered since the outskirts of Appalachian on the Florida Panhandle back at the beginning of the Narvaez expedition. So Cabeza de Vaca says that the people of the cows, and by cows he means buffalo, almost certainly, they had great vitality and capacity. And he also claims that they best understood us and responded to what we asked them. So they get along well with these people. These people have a lot of food. They have settled permanent housing. And this kind of confirms Cabeza de Vaca's belief that if they keep going west, they're going to find native groups that are better equipped to put them up, help them out, and they keep picking up followers and kind of like a retinue, kind of like a following as they keep moving west and visiting different villages and practicing their healing arts and all of that stuff. So, like you said, their reputation precedes them. But they keep hearing about these more advanced societies further to the west that have a lot of corn. They have big villages. Again, these are bigger population centers than what they saw back in the future state of Florida or back in Galveston Bay. These are very different cultures. These are very different people, and they're seeing that. They're noticing that, and that's been good for them through much of this. So remember Estevancio. He is their translator. Like I said, he often goes ahead as sort of a guide or a scout, but it seems like they've all picked up some different languages. But nevertheless, he's the one who often seems to be communicating with new groups that they encounter. And a really telling moment with him comes near the end. So we're going to kind of jump towards the end of the narrative now. And if you look on page 159, this is a really interesting passage. And I've actually provided a clip from a Mexican film, the film version of this story that basically depicts this moment where they finally find other Spaniards. But it's telling, and it's interesting to note who Cabeza de Vaca takes with him on this pivotal occasion where they're finally able to link up with other Spanish people. He doesn't take Dorantes, he doesn't take Castillo, he takes Estevancio. So if we read this passage on 159, it's kind of funny, actually. Cabeza de Vaca says, this is about midway down the one full paragraph on 159. That night, I entreated one of my companions to go after the Christians who were going through the area where we were leaving the land secured. By Christians, he means other Spaniards. And it was a 3-day journey. Again, he doesn't know that at the time. As the editors tell you in a footnote, that's knowledge that he would pick up later. But he's presenting it now as if he already knew it, and he was telling his friends, hey, it's going to be about 3 days to get to the Spanish, the other Spanish. But he didn't really know that at the time. It was a 3-day journey. And by they, he means Dorantes and Castillo. This they judged a troublesome undertaking, excusing themselves because of fatigue and hardship, and in spite of the fact that each one of them would be able to do it better than I on account of being hardier and younger. But seeing their will, the next day in the morning I took with me the black man. That's Estevancio. He rarely refers to him, if ever, by name. He normally refers to him as the black man because, of course, Estevancio occupied a lower social position. Cabeza de Vaca would not have regarded him as an equal. We see how wrong that is now, but, that we have to be honest about his worldview. He would never have thought of a slave as his equal. He would not have talked to a slave on equal terms, and he would not have gone to Estevancio initially to ask for him to come along. But because the other two white guys don't want to go, they're too tired, it's too far, so Cabeza de Vaca gets Estevancio and a bunch of their Native American allies. So he says, I took with me the black man and 11 Indians. And following the trail of the Christians that I found, I passed through 3 places where they had slept. And on this day, all of them probably, went 10 leagues. And the next morning I reached 4 Christians on horseback, who experienced great shock upon seeing me so strangely dressed and in the company of Indians. They remained looking at me a long time, so astonished that they neither spoke to me nor managed to ask me anything, until he eventually addresses them, and then, for all intents and purposes, the journey is over. But a big reason why they know that the Spaniards are nearby is because they've heard the Native Americans talking about the Spaniards. Now, they've also found a few helmets, a few swords, or, pieces of armor that would have been left behind by Spaniards. That's another sign that they're getting close. But if you flip back a few pages to 156, you'll hear some of the accounts that Cabeza de Vaca relates from their Native American allies, who were telling them, hey, the Spanish have been here, and they have been wreaking havoc. So look on page 156, near the bottom of the page. And they even told us how other times the Christians had entered the land and had destroyed and burned the villages and carried off half the men and all the women and boys, and that those who had been able to escape out of their hands now went fleeing, as we saw them so terrorized that they dared not stop in any place. And they neither wanted nor were able to sow or work the land. Rather, they were determined to let themselves die, and they considered this better than waiting to be treated with as much cruelty as they had been up to that point. So this is a pretty frank depiction of what was going on in this general area. So now they've entered northwestern Mexico, an area that had been conquered by another conquistador named Guzman back in 1531. So it had just recently been conquered and colonized. So the Spanish were sort of still in the process of bringing it completely under their control. And we can see from Cabeza de Vaca's relation here what their methods were. They were burning down villages. They were slaughtering people. They were taking a bunch of these Native Americans off and forcing them to work as slaves. They were forcibly converting them to Christianity, but they were also destroying these people's way of life, their land, their villages, their homes, their families. And Cabeza de Vaca does not try to sugarcoat that. He does not conceal that. He does not pretend like that wasn't the case. He's pretty frank about it. And he's even frank about the fact that when he hooks up with the other Spaniards, he kind of tries to tell them to stop. He tells them, hey, maybe don't kill so many people. Maybe stop enslaving people. Just a thought, because he knows how the Native Americans are responding. A lot of them are fleeing their villages and they're hiding out in the mountains because they are terrified of the Christians, the Spanish. So this is, again, kind of part of that desengaño that we were talking about last time. Remember the disillusionment that Cabeza de Vaca and his fellow survivors feel when they realize the expedition failed, European civilization is no longer of much use to them, and they have to adapt to these new ways and these new cultures. So that's almost like an indictment of their way of doing things. Their way didn't work. They have to adopt new ways. And that kind of makes them sad, in a general way. It seems to at least make Cabeza de Vaca a little bit sad. And that sort of, disillusionment, being sort of disheartened, that permeates some passages of the narrative. But it kind of comes back once again here because he's disappointed to find out that his fellow Christians, his fellow Spaniards, who he thought so highly of, have been acting this way. Because over the course of his journey, he's become pretty sympathetic to his Native American allies, right? He thinks pretty highly of some of them. Now notice the change in his opinion. He didn't think very highly of the groups back in Galveston. He didn't think very highly of the groups that were making him pull up roots and were enslaving him. He didn't like them very much. And we can understand why. Although, again, he was, misinformed about things, but he was also mistreated. But more recently, he's been treated very well. Right? And he owes his survival to these groups that have taken him in, allowed him to practice as a physician, given him food, giving him, sustenance, a place to stay, helping him learn languages, helping him meet new people. He's somewhat indebted to them. And he feels that. And he feels a certain affection for them. So it bothers him, it troubles him when he sees the Spaniards killing, pillaging, raping, burning villages. He doesn't want that. So this brings us to what we were sort of mentioning at the beginning, which is the ongoing debate about Cabeza de Vaca and where he fits into a larger history of colonialism in the Americas. Some readers, and I mentioned this in the week 2 discussion post, some readers think that he has a change of heart. He experiences a conversion by the end of the narrative, and he becomes something different than a typical conquistador who would only want to conquer and colonize. And some argue that his affection for his native allies, the fact that he discourages the Spaniards from being so cruel and brutal, or even just his honesty in describing what was going on during this time, sort of mark him as, according to some, as maybe more progressive, more forward-thinking than a lot of his contemporaries and fellow conquistadors. That was a popular reading in earlier decades. I give you the quote from the American novelist Henry Miller when he talks about how Cabeza de Vaca redeems himself by, caring about his native friends at the end. He redeems himself. He kind of cancels out all the bloody, expedition narratives from Cortez and Pizarro or who else, all these other conquerors. And it's something different. It's something good. It's something that we can kind of wrap our arms around. And that was a pretty common reading for a long time. I mean, Miller was writing back in like the middle of the 20th century, and people did sort of feel that way about Cabeza de Vaca, for a long time. But now, a lot of scholars take a little bit of a different view, and they point out that yeah, he does have some sympathy and regard for some of these native groups, but he also is still an agent of colonialism. And he never repudiates Spain's colonial mission. He never says, we're wrong for even being here. We're wrong for trying to take over this land and subjugating the Native Americans to our rule. He has no problem with the Native Americans that he's encountered and become friends with. He has no problem with them becoming subjects of the Spanish king. That seems right to him. He has no problem with them being converted to Christianity. In fact, that's one of the reasons he gives for why the Spanish shouldn't be so brutal to these people. Because he claims, look, they're not very aggressive. They're not super warlike, not like the Mariames or some of those groups back in Texas. They're not very warlike. They practice agriculture. They're pretty sophisticated. They have really sort of advanced societies. They have big population centers. They're really smart. They're nice. I like them. I think they would be really good Christians. That's what he says, essentially. They would make very good candidates for conversion. They would make good subjects. That really is the argument that he's making, not only to the fellow Spaniards he encounters in northwest Mexico, but also to the king, right? By providing all of this in his official letter of relation, he's also trying to present that case to the king. These people, we can work with these people. We can make them subjects. We can make them Christians. They will help feed us. They might even work with us. We can assimilate them. We can sort of make them live the way we live. I think they're going to be cool with that. So a lot of scholars in more recent decades point to that and say, how can we really call him an ally of the Native Americans when he was still a proponent of converting them, subjugating them and taking their land, essentially, or at least saying that their land now belonged to the King of Spain. So you guys can decide where you land in that debate. You don't have to be all the way on one side or another. You might think it's kind of complicated, right? Maybe there is some transculturation here. Maybe Cabeza de Vaca has changed in some pretty important ways. He certainly has a greater understanding, a greater appreciation for some of these native groups and their customs, their practices, their religion, their social organization. But at the same time, he remains loyal to the Spanish crown and he remains loyal to Spanish colonialism writ large. He has no problem with it. He just wants it to be perhaps less brutal, less cruel. So we can decide, what we think about that and how we're going to reconcile that with some of our more modern perspectives and understandings. So that's pretty much it. And what I want you guys to do as you're finishing up the book, again, make sure you've kind of consumed the entire critical apparatus, the intro, the book. Feel free to hop on Google if you want to learn more about any of the stuff that we've talked about. If you want to learn more about Cabeza de Vaca, if you want to know more about letters of relation as an official genre, if you want to know more about other examples of letters of relation, or these like official accounts, these expedition narratives, if we want to call it that, we're going to see plenty more of those, well, a couple more of those next week. So in week 3, I'll give you an example from John Smith. Very similar type of document as he explores what is now Massachusetts. He also did it for Virginia. It is the John Smith of the, Pocahontas legend. But he was a real person, and he really was an explorer operating on behalf of the British Crown. And he was basically doing the same thing that Cabeza de Vaca was doing, but he didn't have this long, wonderful, fantastical journey. But he's providing information. He mentions Native Americans kind of in passing, but he's more focused on resources, the geography of the coastline, and how good of a place this would be to colonize. So again, Smith does that for Virginia. He also does it in what is now Massachusetts. Another example from the English language canon would be Thomas Harriot, who also wrote expedition narratives or sort of letters of relation about Massachusetts and Virginia, these early colonies claimed by the English. So again, this is not just a Spanish thing. All the European powers were conducting expeditions. They were all conquering land that was already inhabited. They were all subjecting Native Americans to great abuses and death. And they were all writing these types of documents so they could figure out what they were looking at, the lands they were acquiring, and what might come next in this process of colonialism. So Cabeza de Vaca is a part of this much larger tradition that really defines colonialism in all of the Americas: South America, Mexico, the U.S., Canada, the Caribbean. It plays out a little bit differently, but a lot of these notes are the same. So again, when you hear Carlos Fuentes or other scholars refer to this as the first, maybe like the first real example of colonial American lit, even though we might not technically think of the narrative as literature in the traditional sense, you can see why, right? The themes, the subject matter, what's actually happening here in this narrative would continue to play out in the Americas for hundreds of years. Whether it was the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the English, they were all doing similar things. Differences, of course, but similar threads unite all of those projects. So the literature that started to get written about that had a lot of the same elements that we see here in this text. In terms of subject matter, in terms of the position of the protagonist and how he's a European exposed to the New World, but he maybe deep down in his core always remains a European and always remains loyal to European values and European kings. That gets repeated. The mistreatment of Native Americans, of course, gets repeated, and this becomes sort of stock in trade. This becomes core elements of what would later become American literature. And if we're thinking a little bit more of identity, if we're thinking a little bit more about the complex, messy nature of American identity, even just U.S. identity, we might think more about Cabeza de Vaca's transformation, or at the very least the changes that he does undergo, even if we don't think he has a complete conversion or a complete change of heart. We do see him pick up aspects of new cultures. So isn't this kind of what it is to be an American? It's an amalgamation of a lot of different things, right? You take some old European cultures, you combine them with New World cultures, and you end up with something distinct and unique. Think about the whole idea of self-making. Isn't that central to the American story as well? The idea that it doesn't matter who you were before. You can come to America, you can come to the U.S. and make a new and perhaps better life for yourself. You can create a new identity. It doesn't matter what happened before. Is that also true with Cabeza de Vaca? Even though he's in the future U.S. long before it's the U.S., does his journey and all the cultural collisions, all the different things that happen along the way, does that journey perhaps represent a little bit about American identity? Does it perhaps foreshadow future developments, not just in literature, but also real things that would happen in these places? Is he kind of a representative American in some ways? Some scholars say yes, some say no. You guys should decide what you think about it. All right, so we'll move ahead quickly to a preview of next week. I'll just tell you that it's a lighter week in terms of the reading load. So if at the beginning of week 3 you are still working on Cabeza de Vaca, if you're still finishing up, that's fine. In week 3, we're going to take a look at a couple of these additional expedition narratives, just kind of excerpts. We're not going to read the entire things, just to give you a little bit more context. And then we're going to take a look at some Native American folktales. Because a common mistake in American Lit classes is to forget that there was already a literary tradition in the Americas before any European ever stepped foot in this part of the world. Now, a lot of that literature was not necessarily written down, although some of it was. A lot of it would become written later, but a lot of these literary traditions that we find in Native American groups would have been oral in nature, but they were still engaged in a lot of really interesting storytelling, a lot of narrative. And that stuff still exists. It's changed a lot. So we're going to talk about not just the folk tales themselves, but also the way those folk tales got recorded, the way they got written down later, much later, largely by white academics. We're going to talk about the sort of troubled history of that whole process and how we can understand those folk tales today. But the tales themselves are pretty short. The excerpts from the expedition narratives are also short. So use week 3 to your benefit. You can either catch up on Cabeza de Vaca or you can move ahead because we're going to have much heavier reading weeks to come. So week 3 is pretty light. Week 4 is also pretty light. But once we get to week 5, week 6, and week 7, it gets heavy. So keep that in mind. Look at the schedule and make your decisions accordingly. All right? So email me with questions or concerns. And otherwise, I will see you next week.